I wonder if our forebears in this church in the winter in the 19th century were constantly having their glasses fogged up. Can you see my breath? Florence Nightingale led quite a life. Yet when you hear a typical version of her story in a children's book or a brief bio, you don't hear half of what she accomplished or any of her failings. Her gender is undoubtedly partially responsible for her not getting full credit. A woman succeeding as a nurse, well, that's been long accepted. That part of the story is fine. And that she went on to organize, professionalize, and improve the practice of nursing, well, that fits too, at least with the 20th century version of the narrative. But when she went to the field hospital in the Crimean War, what are we told about what she did there? She carried a lamp, and she brought solace to the wounded soldiers, and she did the washing up. She cleaned. Yeah, the stories offer some tacit recognition that she was innovating and that she was running the operation. She directed other people to clean up the filthy mess of soiled beds, the nearby open cesspools, and the unwashed hands. Though even when that story is told, it's having her in charge of other nurses. What you might never have been told, what you might never have heard, is that bringing about a transformation in hospital practice to make what she did, other than a one-time improvement in one facility where she was, required her to basically invent the field of statistics-based medical record keeping. Before her, even counting was a rarity. How many soldiers or other people undergoing medical care were dying of what? She instituted counting, and she developed ways to turn counting into useful information. She did a lot more than washing up. After the war, she was the first woman ever to be chosen as a fellow of the Royal Statistical Society. It wasn't good enough to stumble onto a solution to the hygiene problems that were infecting and killing the wounded in droves. She needed to show that it was working. Being right is great, but being heard is usually a much greater challenge. And yes, stumble onto the solution is the right way to think of it. Germs had not yet been discovered. No one yet knew why filth caused infection and death, but she managed to do the right thing without knowing the right reason. So Nightingale started keeping records and invented this graphical representation of her results. Yeah. If you published a nightmare like this today, you'd probably be featured in the Graph Crimes Twitter feed. But at the time, this innovation made all the difference. Collecting data in the first place and then presenting it in a way that was, well, kind of readable. All you need to know is that the light blue wedges include the deaths from infection among wounded, and that they shrunk markedly over time, particularly as a ratio to battlefield casualties. Chances are that Nightingale's contributions would have been a footnote to history without her inventing this graph. In that hypothetical world, it probably would have taken years or decades for her ideas to be accepted. Or perhaps even that footnote wouldn't appear. She was a woman in the 19th century, after all. History is a struggle. Sometimes you win. Usually you don't win until later. One thing that you probably didn't figure out looking at that weird graph is that it took 6 or 7 months before her innovations brought about a statistically definitive effect that no one could ignore. That's an observation that you won't find in the typical biography and that seldom even shows up in the scientific biographies. I had to do the calculations myself. And ever since I did those calculations, I've been thinking about how her experience then compares to our experience in our current epidemic. I mean, yeah, Nightingale got things done a lot faster than the 2-year fiasco we're in the midst of right now, but she had operational control in a single facility with military discipline, and she figured out what to do fairly rapidly. and yet fixing things still took a while. No record I've seen gives any indication as to why. Nightengale didn't write a tell-all book, perhaps to her credit. If we had a chance to ask for some passages from that non-existent book, from The Ghost of Florence, I suspect that the most popular question would be, was she indeed a lesbian, as widely believed? But I'd ask for some war stories about why it took quite so long to turn things around in that hospital. I find myself imagining her talking to the personnel at the hospital. No, you have to remove the cesspool that's close to the patient's bed. The barrier you built beside it won't help. The miasma is airborne. To explain, before the discovery of microbes, the prevailing belief was that miasma, roughly meaning bad-smelling air, was the vector that led from filth to infection. Nightengale, in my imagination, goes on, and no, it doesn't matter that it's more than 2 meters away. Or her telling her nurses, I don't care if you're bored of washing blankets and need an off-ramp, whatever that is. We need to keep doing it for as long as the wounded keep getting them dirty. And it must have been especially fun dealing with the men who are accustomed to running everything their way. No, doctor, washing your hands between patients for the last 5 days does not mean you can skip it today because your skin is irritated. You have to do it every time. No, you can't plan to ever stop doing it. It is now and will be for the rest of your career the right thing to do. And you know what? Before long, it will seem insane that there was ever a time that people didn't do it. I mean, what do you think this is? Some simplified history story where all the problems are solved in a self-contained epic stroke and everyone lives normally ever after? Huh. Yeah, they probably did think that. Because we all think that, or at least we feel that. When we learn about history, whatever the status is at the end of the story seems normal, because that's the way things are now, or at least it was a step toward the way things are now. In stories about transformative events, the situation at the start of the story is weird and wrong, and the events corrected it. When you're living history, though, transformative events are unsettling, to say the least. It's hard to have faith in change when every change in history stories feels inevitable, because changes in our lived history do not feel that way. We've all heard that history is written by the victors, but it's more than that. History is written about the victories. We have to remember that when you are living history, it's mostly not victories. History stories make the past seem like simple, efficient progress. Those stories gaze down on us in silent criticism of the torturous muddles that we live through as we travel around the coils of the slinky. The heroes in our abbreviated stories are also always better than the people that we know. But Nightengale was no saint. She was an outspoken supporter of British colonialism. She was openly racist, referring to colonized people as inferior and barbarians, and showed an open disdain for their deaths. She weaponized the miasma theory as a reason for disdaining the unclean, who she included colonized people, sex workers, and various others. That kid's book's seeming a little creepy now, huh? Even her accomplishments had a dark lining. Her rigid notions of what constituted proper regimented nursing behavior are still causing harm in populations where traditional ad hoc approaches are more appropriate for the circumstances. We hold our living heroes to standards that we only think our historical heroes met, because we only know the children's book versions of their stories. Nightengale also did not have unmitigated success in her life. Yeah, she transformed hospital hygiene and medical statistics, but she also got sick right after that at about age 40 and was plagued with what was probably ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, a condition that afflicts many people following viral infections, including COVID. Despite that, she continued to have an impact on the development of nursing. However, when she tried to endow a chair at Oxford with her own money, trying to create what would be the first academic position in what we would probably now call applied population statistics, they refused. When she petitioned the British government to start collecting the statistics that would make more analyses like hers possible, they balked at it. In fact, the last of her recommendations wasn't implemented until the 1980s. She would have had to live double her already long life to see all her ideas come into being. Life lived on the edge, by which I mean the edge of the slinky, rather than taking the shortcut past the gaps, is mostly not victories. It tries our faith to live in the middle of history, not yet knowing the conclusions. But remember, victories sometimes still happen. I want to thank everyone who helped make this service possible. Blessed be.